cover technology, Silicon Valley, how it interacts with Washington, which is a lot more than normal these days. And obviously, kind of like Congress, technology, the industry has typically been dominated by males. That has slowly changed over time. And I think, kind of like Judy, a big thing that I try to do a lot is when I am writing stories that sometimes do it, it it inherently involves a lot of male leaders, for example. It's important if you get in some more outside, whether that's like a strategist perspective from a female. And I also think that it helps kind of break what we've typically thought of this industry. So we might get to this later, but one of the things I cover is cryptocurrency. And if you know anything about some of the stereotypes about crypto, is the whole crypto bro thing when it first started. And it's actually me and my colleague Julia, so both females, who cover crypto. We cover a special feature called Crypto Corner. And I had somebody from one of the leading crypto exchanges tell me a few days ago, they were like, we really value and want to come to you to talk about these things because honestly, it's a show of where the industry is heading that you're having two female journalists cover this. And I think it kind of helps break it up a bit. And yeah, I think of the cryptocurrency conversation a lot because when I go into these events, there are a lot of males, and I actively will seek out some more female voices. And I think that's important. And also, I only graduated 3 years ago from undergrad, so I remember college very well still. And one of the ideas they tried to instill a lot was, a straight journalist is supposed to provide news as straight as possible, and you do try that. And part of that is just offering the wide range of views. Inherently, stories are going to be framed in a certain way. You can't completely avoid bias, but I think by trying to get the full picture in there, that's what's really important. And I try not to treat it like a checklist, but sometimes I have to make a mental note of, no, this does not have enough voices and representation in it.
I'd like to just follow up on your comments just now. So you mentioned that you do deliberately, right? I mean, you think about making sure you seek out more female voices. What other practices do you actively engage in when it comes to representing gender and power? I mean, Carrie, I know you mentioned you've gone a different route, right? But I'd like to hear your perspectives on that.
Yeah, well, like I said, I now work, I freelance broadcast and freelance write columns and opinion pieces, but I also work for Independent Women's Forum, which is, we have a 501c3 and a 501c4. So for the C4, we do lobbying and direct influence on bills. And we see it as our mission to let people know that all issues are women's issues. I think when it comes to gender, quite often the media wants to pigeonhole us to say, oh, women's issues are only abortion and, a few narrow wedge issues. Well, no, that's not the case. We have a Foreign Policy Center, which my colleague Megan Mobbs runs. She was just named today by President Trump to the Board of Visitors for West Point. She's the daughter of Keith Kellogg, who is Trump's chief envoy to Ukraine. And then we also have an energy policy center. I help co-run our economic policy center. What wasn't mentioned is I also used to work at Goldman Sachs and Moody's Investor Service on Wall Street. So I like to joke I'm a recovered bond girl because I used to rate bonds. But economic policy affects women, and women, we make 80% of consumer choices. So we are the powerhouses of the economy. And so when it comes to having our voices heard, we believe that women should be in all spaces in the media sharing our voices. And in particular, we're looking for conservative perspectives to be shared. And I think one thing, a big issue that is a really hot button issue right now is the issue of gender ideology. We've been very outspoken. You've probably seen Riley Gaines, the swimmer. She's one of our spokeswomen. We believe the definition of woman has been basically tried to be unraveled, and we think that this is going to create a lot of dangerous situations for the bodily autonomy and integrity of women. And so we've done a lot of polling on this, and we found, other polling have found similar ideas as well, that 80% of Americans do not want biological men and women's sports. and it's even higher for biological men in women's prisons. We've done interview series and documentary series on women who are affected by biological men in California, where men were being transferred without even having to show any sort of hormonal treatment or anything. They just were transferred into women's prisons, and women felt very unsafe and suffered assault. And so we just think we push back on those narratives in the media. But again, it's more than just that. And so we think the women's spaces are all spaces within the economy and national security. And I think also just the idea that women are monolithic is another trope that is perpetuated within the legacy media, that if you're a woman you must be on the left. We think that's just not true, and that's why you're seeing so many new voices being, Megyn Kelly. I've been on Megyn Kelly's program. Several of my colleagues have been on her programs. She's an example of someone who's created her own ecosystem as a female voice, very powerful voice, and I think you're going to see more like her. Same thing with Allie Beth Stuckey, who's with The Blaze, the media company founded by Glenn Beck. So we look for alternatives, although we love to work with mainstream press as well. I will say, unfortunately, sometimes, I've been on programs on, cable networks, and I'm treated very badly by progressives who scream at me and, again, dehumanize me. And I think it's unfortunate, because I'm happy to talk with them. And I can't say the same for a lot of people that I've met on the left. So, but I came here today because I want to help the media. I'm not here. I think some conservatives just want to burn the whole thing down. I think we can make it work, but I think that it takes good faith on both sides.
Thank you, Carrie. Other perspectives on things you can actively do to engage in, representation for women?
This is a small, I'll go ahead, I guess. This is a small thing I do. And just like the previous topic, I'm not always successful, but I do, try my best to do it, is with certain public figures who are women, I try not to just reference them as the wife of someone, or the girl, like Lauren Sanchez, who's was a journalist and is now Jeff Bezos's fiance. In a story involving Lauren Sanchez, I won't just say Jeff Bezos's fiance. Like, she has her own identity. She is not just, a spouse or a girlfriend of someone else. And I do the same with, like, Melania Trump. I won't just say First Lady. I do make an attempt to say either, she's a mom, she's a former model. With Jill Biden, do the same thing, a Northern Virginia community college professor. I do think it's just like a little detail in stories that doesn't just define a woman by who she's married to. And I'll do the same thing for men as well. Like when I'm writing, if I write about Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, a lot of Taylor Swift fans, just know Travis Kelce as her boyfriend. I will say he's the quarterback. So it goes both ways. But particularly for women, I would say I do make an effort to make sure I'm not just identifying someone by whom they're, the male they're married to or committed to.
Kind of going off of that, one of the biggest lessons that I've learned in my first 3 years of journalism is how subtle and less is sometimes more. So you're talking about just adding, 1 or 2 words to convey a certain label. And I think that sometimes journalists, at least young journalists like myself, can sometimes fall into the trap of, I want to get a certain idea across, and I think that it requires, I don't know, 2 to 3 full sentences. And sometimes it really is just about, maybe it's an adjective that you use or an adjective that you don't use. And even in headline writing, this is kind of getting away specifically from gender, but one lesson that an editor told me was that, if you're saying Joe says X, amid backlash means something different than after backlash. That's a very general example, but kind of the way in which you frame cause and effect, for example. And I just think sometimes when we are making a very active effort on our end to represent these voices, I think that it's important that when you're done, say, writing a story, you go back into your copy and you look for subtle changes, not necessarily revamping an entire piece. And I think I used to overwrite a lot, and it was just very obvious what I was trying to do. And it's, just less is more sometimes.
Thank you. If I could push a little bit more on this topic, when female politicians, so we heard from a number of speakers in our panels this morning about female politicians who are not just denigrated, but really demonized with misinformation in the media on the basis of their gender. Is there a role for journalists to respond to or correct or try to balance the record when that occurs?
Okay, well, one example that comes to mind actually involves, I don't know if Michael LaRosa is still here, but a story involving Jill Biden right around the time before Joe Biden decided to exit the race. There was a lot of criticism of Jill Biden, uh, particularly among conservative circles, Carrie, saying that Jill Biden was kind of the driving force for Joe Biden to be staying in the White House race, that he should have dropped out sooner, that Jill Biden was power hungry and really wanted her husband to remain in power so she could still be first lady. So that was a story that was circulating, and there were a lot of voices, particularly male voices, that were speaking out against Jill Biden because of what her husband's decision was. So I wrote a story about the criticism that she was receiving, and I included, what some would argue is legitimate criticism of Jill Biden, but I also gave the perspective of some other voices who are women, including one professor in gender studies who argued that a lot of the criticism of Jill Biden was very sexist in nature because they were portraying her as this kind of Lady Macbeth character. And it really plays into questions about gender roles, and there is the woman really conniving behind the scenes to stay in power. I thought that was an important part of the story that I hadn't even considered when I first set out to do this piece. I didn't do the piece thinking that that was going to be the story. I was more looking into, the nature of this criticism and what it means. And Jill Biden's spokesperson also weighed in. It wasn't Michael LaRosa at the time, but she weighed in saying that women are often, told to speak up, but not too loud, to stand by their man, but not always. So they gave, I thought, a very, almost like very fresh perspective. It wasn't usually you go to the White House, and if they don't like the story you're writing, they won't comment, or they'll chew you out over the phone and off the record, and then you write your story anyway. But that wasn't the case. They really felt that this was important enough for them to speak out about it. So it's just one example, but it's a story that there was a woman in politics who, whether it was fair or not, was receiving a lot of criticism related to her gender.
Yeah, I remember that like it was I can't believe that was already like 8 months ago. And that was kind of when I actually was first getting into the tech beat. And so this is kind of a tech oriented answer, but a big problem that we see with misinformation about politicians, really any public figures, is the proliferation of misinformation on social media. And as we know, there's a lot of debate over how social media companies monitor that information. That could be a whole other panel on many panels. But I think that one effective way that I've seen journalists kind of play a part in fact checking, I guess you will, this misinformation is their own use of social media, because the reality is that I could write in a story, make it very clear, this person said this is very much not true, and give the evidence. However, people, unfortunately, and I hate to say this as a journalist, there are many times where people are just reading headlines. They are just reading the first half of a story. I wish it wasn't that way. Hopefully you guys aren't in that category. But so for me, I saw a bunch of journalists actually weighing in on, and again, I'm not saying cross the line of being opinionated, but even just on Twitter or X, for example, which has faced an increasing number of accusations about the information that is spread there, even just a simple resharing of maybe a claim, but then also with the actual fact check. Now, some may argue resharing it is circulating it. It's a vicious cycle. But I do think that at this point, people get a lot of their opinion. They get a lot of their information and news online on social media. And I think using that as a driver is really important because it has so much more of an ability to go viral. And this is misinformation on both sides. And yeah, I think that social media has just made this such a problem. But I think if we kind of reclaim that and use that as a tool, it, hopefully now, again, the disinformation thing could be a whole other panel.
Thank you both. Carrie, I want to turn it to you next. I do want to note that it's not just Democratic female politicians who are the subject of these attacks, right? There are also Republican, I mean, this is both on both sides, right? That we see this type of coverage of women in politics. So Carrie, do you want to comment as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one example is Melania Trump, just in terms of the way she's not celebrated. Compare and contrast the way the media treats Michelle Obama or even Jill Biden. Like, Melania Trump is an objectively gorgeous woman, but she's never been on the cover of Vogue when she was first lady. And I don't expect she ever will be. But at this point, I don't think she needs that validation. But I just think the messages that are, like a Cosmo magazine or 17, like they don't treat Republican women with the same level of celebration. They have their Glamour Woman of the Year awards. If they do have a Republican woman, it will be only a few of them, and they tend to be, an anti-Trump Republican woman. That tends to be the case for a lot of organizations that I'm a Harvard graduate. I would say I love Harvard, and they know I feel this way, but like Harvard IOP or Harvard Poli-Sci, like if they're having a bipartisan panel, it usually means 3 Democrats and 1 never Trump Republican, and that's bipartisan to them. And this is why we have such a cultural breakdown, in my opinion, because there's really no interest to, I often cite the recent motto of the Washington Post, which they put at the top on their masthead, that democracy dies in darkness. Well, the root word of democracy is demos, which means people. And if you're in the dark about half of the country and how that half of the country, their worldview, their values, and you're not seeing them portrayed in celebratory ways as women, this is part of why there's such vitriol against conservative women. So we have a series that we call Champion Women, where we profile conservative women, and we have over 1 million social media followers. We put out that content. We do video profiles of conservative women. There are a few other like conservative women magazines that have been propping up. One is called The Conservator, which is kind of a cute name. And then there's another one called Evie Magazine. So we're creating our own kind of ecosystems where we celebrate conservative women. And it's not that we're we'd celebrate all women, but we just see that conservative women are being left out. And I wanted to say, though, to your first part of your question on misinformation, I wanted to quote a study here from Monmouth University that came out a few years ago. It said that 77% of the respondents believe that traditional media outlets publish fake news. And what was stunning about this was that 65% of the respondents said that fake news applies to how media outlets make editorial decisions and what they choose to report, while just 25% said fake news applies only to when the media outlet spreads inaccurate information. So as journalists, I think that's important to think about. There's the sin of commission. How am I covering something? But then also the sin of omission. What am I not covering? And whose voices are not being heard? And I would say that conservative women are very much left out. And just a couple other stats, came armed with stats. There was a study by Indiana University, and it found that only 7% of journalists said they are Republicans. And this was far lower than the 24% of American adults who identify as Republicans. Pew Research Center conducted a national survey of more than 500 reporters, editors, and executives, and found that only 34% of the media identified as liberal, that 34% of the media identified as liberal, while only 7% of the media identified as conservative. So again, just thinking about the bubble that we're in, we all live in bubbles, and I think being aware of that is half the battle.
Thank you all. That reminds me, your last comment, Carrie, it reminds me of the book by Nick Usher, News for the Rich, White, and Blue, that came out in the last couple of years. I want to go back to something that you mentioned, Miranda, about when we see these posts on social media, particularly about female politicians or female public figures. And my sense is that from your comments, this bothers you when you see this, right? But is there a role for professional journalists here, or their news organizations? And when it's based in inaccurate information.
Yeah, I think that sort of, I guess, goes back to my last point of I think that there's a very fine line that gets walked between journalists fact checking something that happens or someone and kind of inserting their own personal beliefs. With the example, I think that if something is, blatantly untrue, whether that's about Democrat, Republican, Independent, whatever it may be. I think that that's the social media example that I used was that there is absolutely nothing wrong, and I would encourage journalists if they have the evidence to back it up. Journalists' job is to gather evidence to back up whatever story they're writing. You should never be publishing a story if you think that you don't have enough to back it up. And so I think that we already have a lot of the tools to I don't like using the word fact check, but to provide more context maybe is a better way at it. And I think this happens through social media. It does happen in stories, but again, I think that some people read just headlines and it becomes a sensationalism thing. So I think if you can catch people where they get their information is kind of the right way about it. And I also think that you kind of on the idea of omission, you have to make an effort to be looking at where the narratives are heading. With your story about Joe Biden, that wasn't, necessarily something you had to do, but you saw where people's sentiments were, and you saw that this one was valuable of needing to be explored fully. But also, I think sometimes what you think might not be news could very well be news to other people and other groups of people that maybe you aren't aligned with. But so I think also just getting a second opinion is really important. I'm constantly am flagging news for my editor of, is this newsworthy? And sometimes they're like, oh yeah. And I was like, oh, I thought it. Sometimes I think too, journalists think that it's obvious when something is happening because you're so in that bubble. But the reality is you are in a bubble. So you study this stuff every day, you see it, but the general public doesn't. So I think double checking yourself and using social media would be my two answers.
Yeah, I think also there is a balance, especially for journalists in this day and age, of the question of whether you're amplifying some of the misinformation by reporting on it. And we have to make that judgment almost every day. It, yes, you want to, shoot down misinformation, but at the same time, as soon as the Hill tweets out one of our stories, that goes to millions of people. And if it's about some misinformation that is sexist or racist or some other terrible ist, you don't want to, put more of that out there. So I do think we have to weigh that with some of these stories.
I completely agree with that. And what both of you guys were saying about first comparing and contrasting what people in the Beltway think versus the rest of the country. There's an interesting polling outfit called Echelon Insights. If you know Echelon Insights, Kristen Soltis Anderson runs that. They did a really interesting overlay for a period of time about what people were at the time. It was still Twitter, so I can say what they were tweeting about before it became X. But it compared and contrasted the topics that people in the Beltway were tweeting about and overlaid the same timeline with people outside the Beltway. And there was quite often some things were the same, but there were a lot of other things that were not really relevant to people in the Beltway and vice versa. And so it was very telling that, again, there's a gap between what the so-called elites believe in what's important to them versus the rest of the country. The other point, though, on what you said, Judy, about the misinformation being amplified, I think I would bring as a case example of that. I think the media in general for conservatives, not just conservative women, they quite often the legacy media will take the worst of conservatism or people who glom on to say they're Republican or whatever, and paint that as everyone, and then they want to make everyone be this way. And it's like, okay, well, if everyone's a Nazi, no one's a Nazi. If everyone's a white supremacist, no one's a the words lose meaning when you try to glom it on to everyone. And then when you also try to give it more, you end up trying to give it more power than it really has. Like, for example, in the 2016 election, the alt-right was something that I believe, as a conservative, the media was trying to make like mainstream it to the point where Hillary Clinton gave this big speech about the alt-right. And the guy who came up with the phrase, I've never met him. He is an extremist. I mean, he was so excited. He's like, yes, she said the phrase alt-right. Now so many more people know about alt-right thanks to Hillary Clinton. Because it was basically Hillary with her friends in the media trying to make conservatives all out to be like like super far right conspiracy theorists, even though the vast majority of Republicans didn't even know what alt-right is necessarily, and don't share their viewpoints. And same thing with my first press conference. Oh, in 2020, I was covered the Trump White House for the last year for a media startup founded by John Solomon, who used to be at the Hill. And I was in the room, and I'll never forget my first press conference when I asked Trump a question about, I had just interviewed Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong newspaper executive it was one of his last media interviews before he was taken into prison, which might be for his last time of his arrest. So I asked President Trump about that, as well as just Hong Kong in general. It was during the protests. And then another reporter who's with One American News, which the left loves to call a conspiracy network, she asked a very substantive question about, Chanel Rion is her name. She asked a question about Middle East policy in Iran. And then someone who was sitting on the front row, who was with NBC News, she asked him a question about QAnon. And in my head, I'm just like, how ironic. The two outlets here who are, perceived as right-wing conspiracy outlets or whatever, we're asking him substantive questions. And then NBC, who has the front row on the seating chart from the White House Correspondents Association, is asking about this gutter conspiracy fringe theory just to make Trump look bad and to try to divert the attention of the American people, and make it seem like Trump's aligned with them, which he's not. And so I personally endorse what Caroline Levitt's done with the White House press room to open it up and allow more bloggers and other voices, because again, the White House briefing room until now was not 50-50 representative of the worldview of the country.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by the story you told about the use of alt-right and these other terms. I actually wrote an article that got published with a co-author about journalists' use of the term alt-right or not. But in any case, I was also struck by Judy, and then the rest of the others talking about how you have to be careful not to amplify these things, and that by responding or repeating, you worry you would be doing that. Are there other pitfalls that you try to avoid when reporting specifically on stories that have to do with gender and power, and where I would say where misinformation is involved?
Small. Something that I'm still working on, actually, I had my yearly review and my editor and I were talking about it just a few weeks ago, is I think when you're dealing with topics that have like gender power, that have become known to be very sensitive, I have some journalists have a tendency to sort of hedge and to keep themselves like not responsible. So, for example, saying he appeared to believe this or the apparent thing. And sometimes you really just don't know. But I think that if you have the evidence to back up a claim, you should write that. If a second set of eyes, like an editor, looks at it and says, this is veering on whether opinionated or you need more evidence to back it up. So I think part of it is honestly just either not being confident enough in what you're writing, or maybe that's a sign of, oh, actually, I don't have enough right now to even be talking about this in a story. So I think sometimes for me personally, I will allude to something, but I won't. I like, did he support it or did he not? Like, and sometimes we don't know. And if that's the case, you should explain why you don't know. So I think sometimes we try to circumvent and take ourselves off the responsibility of it. But I think that clear writing, direct writing is best. Something I'm still working on.
One thing maybe it kind of relates to your question, Kim, is I think sometimes I have to be prepared to defend what I do write about. One thing that comes to mind, and I mentioned Lauren Sanchez before, Jeff Bezos's, a former journalist who is also Jeff Bezos's fiance, made headlines last year. I was covering a White House state dinner, which is like beyond black tie event. The White House welcomes, the heads of state from another country. It might have been Australia. I don't remember what country they were honoring. So Lauren Sanchez arrives with Jeff Bezos arm in arm, and you could almost hear a gasp among the press gaggle because everyone's wearing these very elaborate gowns, these beautiful dresses and tuxedos. And she walks in with a very, very bright red, low cut, extremely low cut gown past the press area. And, confident as can be, keeping her head up. And then I tweeted out a photo of it, did not, offer any editorial um, comment about it. And it went everywhere where people everywhere had an opinion about what she decided to wear at the White House. And so I wrote a story about the reaction she was receiving. Again, I spoke not just with critics of her outfit choice, which there were many, but I also spoke with another gender studies professor who said that dress codes anywhere are inherently sexist anytime you're being told what you can or cannot wear. So I tried to approach the piece with a little more sensitivity than maybe some of the other outlets covering it. But I feel and I got some flack for covering a story about what a woman chose to wear to a fancy White House dinner. But my argument has always been, and I cover a lot, I cover features and the lighter side of Washington, is that optics are a part of the political space. And so that's for one. For two, we also cover, and this is not dismissing that women are often covered in a much more critical way than men, but I also do plenty of stories on men's fashion as well. The Obama tan suit was like a huge drama. John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania, choosing to wear a sweatshirt to the Senate. That was a big story as well. And I covered those equally to the same extent that I covered the Lauren Sanchez controversy. So I think sometimes part of my job is being prepared to defend things that I think are worthwhile of our coverage.
I almost wore my hoodie today. I'm glad I didn't. Yeah, I do think that it's so interesting the backlash that Jim Vandehei and Elon Musk had with their go back and forth. I used to work for Jim Vandehei at Politico, and if you didn't see earlier this year, he gave, or was it late last year? I forget exactly, but he gave a speech at a Press Foundation dinner, and he was angry at Elon Musk because Elon Musk said, "We are all journalists now, and with X, the citizen is the journalist, and there's no demarcation now between a journalist and a citizen. We have the power all in the cell phone to be just as powerful as someone who went to journalism school and sunk a lot of money in a degree like I did, working my butt off as a janitor to get my journalism degree." And I found myself on the side of Elon overall. I think in general, in a democracy, it's good to have more voices, especially since when you look at the history of media and how, with the dawn of television news, you only had the three voices of CBS, NBC, and ABC, and they were the voices of God. Well, I think as a Christian, personally, there's this idea that we're all made in the image of God, imago Dei. We're made in the image of God, so we all have a voice, and so we all have power that we can be able to have those voices heard. I do think what I like about X now is the community notes, because it can put a lot more context, and I've seen this happen over and over where you had a legacy media outlet that was trying to go after a conservative, and then the community notes gives a lot more context, and then the story kind of actually deflates a lot because I saw this over and over because I'm a recovered never Trumper. Again, I've been conservative journalist now for more than 10 years. And so um, initially I was very anti-Trump, but the more I would dig into news coverage and I would see, oh wait, to your point on headlines, and I would see the headline and then I would look at the full context of what he said, or I would actually look at, like, for example, the Washington Post said that, oh, Trump was mocking a disabled reporter. But then when you look at his mannerisms that Trump was using, you would see that he actually did that to lots and lots of other people who were not disabled. It was just one of the mannerisms that he would employ to make fun of people. And he didn't know that the guy was disabled. He had no idea. And so I just saw that pop up over and over. And I like social media for that reason, because I think it can help provide a lot of context when a journalist has missed the mark through either omission or commission.
All right, so shifting just a little bit now to asking you about personally your careers and whether gender has played a role in your careers, and if so, in what ways? And then part of the question, three-part question, is how can journalists make it an asset or at least not a hindrance? Or do you think journalism should be gender neutral? So,
Well, when I was first starting out, I was a TV reporter, and one of the first places I worked at, and when you work in TV, you have to start out in like really little cities and you work your way around the country until you get to a bigger place. And one of my first jobs, one of the news managers, I was right out of college, very young. I look really young, which I'm grateful for now. Back then was not not a great thing. One of the news managers pulled me into his office, a man, and told me, you really need to work on your tracking voice. You sound like young and it's very high pitched. And they sent me to a speech coach to bring down my register. So when you're tracking packages, when you're trying to narrate a story, I would sound a lot more authoritative and, like Dan Rather, but Tom Brokaw type. And so if you look back at any of my work from decades ago, my husband now makes fun of me because it sounds like, Jimmy across the street and got, his dog got lost. It just sounds ridiculous because I was trying to, do what the news manager told me and kind of take on this more masculine voice that he perceived to be more what a newscaster should sound like. And maybe that's something that comes with age. I now realize that I'm just me. And if you don't like my voice and you think I have credibility because of a higher register, then that's on you, I think. So that's just one tale of gender kind of playing a role in my career. Another thing that comes to mind is when I was pregnant, I was still out and about reporting, covering a lot of red carpets where there are a lot of reporters like all packed in together and worrying about my stomach, like getting jostled. And I was interviewing one director one time, a much, much older gentleman. And I was very visibly pregnant. And in the middle of I don't know if this is still working. Can you guys hear me still? Okay. In the middle of the interview, without not relating to anything I was asking about, he just started touching my stomach. And I don't know if it was an age thing or just a man. I don't know what it was. But I didn't call him out by name. But I ended up writing a story about being a pregnant journalist. After the fact, after that happened, and I included that little tale in the story I wrote to try to explain some of the maybe experiences you might have that other people, not men in particular, wouldn't have or would never be confronted with, and how I responded to that. So I don't often write in the first person, but I thought it was an important story to tell because not many people have encounter that sort of thing. I also did the same thing with my son, who a few years ago there was a big RSV epidemic going around with kids getting RSV, which is a respiratory disease, and unfortunately, my son got it. And being a working mom, like I really try not to, do the first person narrative that much or kind of like put my kids out there. But it was very traumatic. He was hospitalized for 4 days, and out of that experience, I decided to write about it. Because I felt like it was something unique to that. I guess any parent could face it, but being a working mom, it just had a different feel to it to me. So I read about it, about my experience and his hospitalization, and he's fine now, thankfully. But it ended up being the longest read story on the Hill's news site for all of 2022. So more people spent more time on that story than any other story on our site for that entire year. So it just really connected with people. So I think there are ways that you don't always have to write yourself into the story, but there are ways that you can use your experiences for good.
Yeah, going off of that, in terms of some of our tech coverage, as I mentioned in the beginning, their tech can be a male dominated space. And also, I was doing some research before this, and tech journalists are also predominantly men, which is weird because when I'm in DC, the DC pool of tech journalists I find are mostly females. But anyway, all this to say, I think I've really tried to use my gender as an asset, specifically covering, for example, artificial intelligence. There's been a lot of concerns about deep fakes, kids' online safety. So in that case, I'm using, I think, both my gender, but also my age, going back to the idea of being thought of as young a lot. I'm 25. I have a high voice as well. I'm constantly being told I need to lower it. And I think I've tried to use that to my advantage though when speaking with, for example, you know, 18, 16-year-old girls who, they're in high school when this threat of these deep fakes are coming out. We're seeing it obviously have a lot of action at the federal level with the Take It Down Act. But I think if you can find the places, again, where you kind of have your own experience that you bring into it, I think that it also just builds trust with some sources. And, I think I'd like to think that, the 17-year-old girl feels a little bit more comfortable talking to me as somebody who is closer to her age than 30, and also, well, not anymore, I guess, but yeah, so I think trying to use that as an asset is very important. But I also think, too, back to the point about being genuine and the whole lowering your voice thing, I have recently started doing more TV hits with our partners, News Nation. And it's been really stressful because I've been really worried about the idea of being perceived as young and not trustworthy as a result. And we have a great management team at the Hill. And I was talking with them and I kept asking, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" And they go, "You sound and look much better when you just are yourself. Like, stop making such an attempt to act older, act more authoritative. You are who you are, and you should own up to that." So I really think being genuine speaks a lot. People see right through it if you're not. And yeah, less is more.
So it's interesting that all three of us have been told to lower our voices, because I have been told that as well. The first time I was presenting as a conservative debater on Fox Business, I asked him for advice. So I opened myself up to it, but I asked John Stossel, the host, for any advice afterward. And I was debating minimum wage policy with a PhD economist from Berkeley. And afterward, John got me on the phone and he's like, "What you wanted to tell him was, you are full of shit. And instead, what you told him was, you are full of shit." And he's like, "That's what your voice sounded like, just so you know." And I was like, wow. I went back and I watched the tape, and I did find that as I was getting more nervous, my voice was going up. They call it up talking. So I think up talking, actually, men and women both do up talking when they're nervous. So I think that's something that people in general, I mean, that's one of the deepest fears people have, is public speaking. And so I think in some ways it's not gender specific, being nervous. But I think there can be some truth, but also I agree with you. Most importantly, Miranda, it's about being yourself. And I think the fact that we have a 27-year-old White House press secretary, I think the youngest in American history, and she's a woman and a young mother. I think Caroline Levitt's a great example for young people, both young men and women, to look up to, as someone who is very articulate and confident at such a young age. I think it speaks to, in part, I mean, her power that she developed online through being a digitally native professional. It's not about your age, and in fact, your age can be an asset quite often. But in terms of your question on personal experience, if you want the full journey of my life, I did have some books donated out back as was stated. So if you'd like to pick up a copy and learn more about the life of a conservative woman, it's called Motorhome Prophecies because my father claimed to be a Mormon cult leader. He was excommunicated from the official Mormon church, and he made my 7 biological siblings and I live in a motorhome. So I grew up with 10 people in motorhomes, sheds, and tents. And my brother was born when our family lived in a tent. We were homeless. And when I took my ACT exam to go to college, we were living in a shed in the Ozarks with no running water and no furnace. So I like to say my childhood careened in between a third world and first world existence in a first world country. And he was abusing me in the name of God. And he put a curse on me in the name of Jesus that I would be raped and murdered if I left his cult. And so it was a lot that I was agnostic for 12 years. And I would say if you look at the religious composition of the media, it is a very secular industry. And through very unexpected circumstances and twists and turns, which the book gets into, I did become a Christian. And one thing, as I've become deeper in my faith, I see more and more how the person I used to be as an agnostic, I was really hostile to people of faith. For me personally, it was because my father had been twisting God and using religion as his own egomaniacal. He was abused as a child, so I try to be as honest and fair to him as possible. But looking back now, I realized how much I allowed my personal bias against religion because of the way that my father had abused religion to affect the way that I was interacting with the world. And so I think, again, it's a perspective, my publisher calls it a cross between hillbilly elegy and Educated by Tara Westover. I've been on Dr. Phil for it. I like to joke, I mean, it's gallows humor, but my family's like Dr. Gold humor, or Dr. Phil Gold. It's Wall Street Journal's reviewed it, CNN, Fox. So it's gotten a lot of press coverage, I think in part because I talk a lot about mental illness, and there is, unfortunately, our country has the highest suicide rate and the highest depression rate in our recorded history. And the second highest in history recorded was during the Great Depression. And I went back and I reviewed, like, our GDP per capita was like a third world country in 1941. And yet we're killing ourselves at a higher rate now today than we were during the Great Depression. And yet we're multiple times more wealthy. So it's not a monetary reason. I believe it's a purpose and a faith-based values gap as our country has been secularizing. And I think the rise of Trump and faith-based conservatism is a big part of a reaction to the broader forces that have secularized our country. So I encourage you to read it. I'm happy to have dialogue or debate or discussion. I believe that's how our country comes together, is by understanding, different worldviews and challenging our own assumptions.
Thank you. We're going to open it up for questions with our remaining time. I was going to thank the panelists after your questions, but thank you. Thank you. That's a nice thing to do. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. My name is Diva Nenadic. I come from Europe. I work at the European University Institute in Florence. What really triggered my attention somehow was your mention of straight journalism. Can you elaborate a little bit on this? What does this mean? And also I was a bit struck somehow with the fact that I think you, Carrie, identified yourself as a conservative journalist. I mean, to our knowledge, because in Europe we don't use these kind of attributes, and in the past journalists were always identified with the beat they cover, so tech journalist, economic or health, and now you identify with political or ideological orientation. So I'm a little bit curious, like, why, when did this happen, and what are the reasons for this? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, first, I love Florence. I went there a couple years ago. Beautiful. So as I mentioned before earlier, I started out initially as the phrase that I used was straight reporter, and then I jumped into opinion journalism. So I moved into opinion journalism a few years after being in the straight news reporting. So in the U.S., and I don't know how it is in your area, but there was, going back, they like to say the gold standard of objective journalism. Objective, that's maybe the word that I would be using to try to describe straight journalism. That was created, the mythology of it was created with Edward R. Murrow during the World War II. So he was one of the famous US broadcasters. He was broadcasting about the bombing of London. And what's interesting to me is that I actually don't even think that, in some respects, I agree with you that I actually don't even think it's possible to be purely objective or purely straight news. But I just mentioned it because, at least in the US, we have an editorial page, an opinion page, and then we have a news page. So like the Wall Street Journal, for example, has an editorial board, and then they have a newsroom. The New York Times has an editorial board, and then they have a newsroom. So what I was saying was that I became on the opinion editorial side of the Washington Times. I then actually moved back into the newsroom, but then I went back into opinion. But yeah, but the difference would be that when I have opinion reporting, I'm saying what I think, versus if I'm just reporting the facts, then I'm not putting a spin on it. But that's where I actually agree with you, that I actually don't really think that it's even possible. And I think part of why Trump won is because he would say that the media treats him so unfairly, that they pretend to be objective, or they pretend to be straight journalism. But when you look at, for example, you can look up the political donations for people who work at news outlets. Overwhelmingly, they donate to Democrats. You can look at party registration. Party registration of journalists, overwhelmingly Democrat over Republican. Atheist, agnostic among journalists, highly overrepresentative relative to the US population. So it's not to say that you can't have these markers and not be objective. I just think that Trump showed a big gap between the values and the worldview of people who work in media and the rest of the country. And so for me, I just said, well, you know what? I'm not going to pretend that I don't have a worldview. At least for me, I feel like I'm being more honest with myself by saying I do conservative journalism. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the panel a lot. I was wondering if you guys could go a little more in depth about. I'm interested in sort of what it's like in the newsroom around these issues. Like, is there solidarity and support for women in journalism around these issues? And to give you like an example, I know some of you worked at the Hill. This is kind of what spawned my question. Is I don't know if you were there at the time or if you know people were there at the time, but the firing of like Katie Halper and Brianna Joy Gray, who were fired for their opinion at the Hill. I wonder, how's those kind of things received in the newsroom? Is it looked at through a gendered lens? You just speak to that.
Yeah, I've been at the Hill for 14 years, so I was there then. To be honest, and I don't think this is going to be a satisfying answer for you, Rising is a completely separate. It's almost like the opinion side of a paper, where we don't have interaction. It doesn't cross over into the newsroom. So there really wasn't, as far as I'm aware, any talk amongst our side, because one doesn't affect the other, if that makes sense. So I know that's probably not, the juiciest bit of insight I could give. But in terms of that, not to plug the Hill, but I feel that it's very supportive for women, just, by the sheer fact that we're here talking about these issues, and I'm comfortable talking about my experience there. And some of the advice that I give to younger journalists is always to get a mentor, whether it's a woman mentor or a male mentor. And some of the best mentors I've ever had in my life, I've found at the Hill. Our editor-in-chief, who recently left, was my personal mentor for my 14 years at the Hill, and just an incredible guide to me. So, and to be, an older guy helping a younger woman without, you have to choose your mentors wisely, I would say. But it has been a very supportive environment. And they backed up journalists as well, who a lot of women in particular get a lot of online hate. When you write a story that people don't like, then it's one thing to get criticism, which you expect for any sort of story. But when something goes viral and you're getting an incoming of stuff on social media, the Hill's been really supportive in, especially women, helping them to withstand that, and also, take measures when necessary if security is an issue, which unfortunately sometimes it is.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've only been at the Hill for just under 2 years. But the one thing I was going to add when it comes to, I guess, just more politics in general, and I always tell people this, I honestly do not know the political affiliations of like 80% of the people that I work with. And we team up on stories a lot. So I am seeing my other colleagues raw writing, and honestly, and again, maybe they're just really good at hiding it, but I'd like to think the Hill has really prided itself on trying very hard to be middle of the line. And also, just on the point that you made about women's safety, going back to the whole young thing, especially when I was on breaking news and writing more like he said, she said pieces that got a lot of clicks online, I constantly had people saying, "Oh, well, she's like a 15-year-old and finding photos of me from my Instagram or something," constantly all the time. And yeah, management has been great. And also, they even said sometimes you just have to separate yourself from it. I would delete Twitter for a few days or whatever. But they also, again, very actively monitor those sorts of situations, even though we do have a predominantly male management, for example. I think they are really, really good at looking out for us.
Yeah, the Hill was my first job out of college. I worked at the Hill in 2005, and now I go on the Hill TV, and so it's been interesting to watch how I think the culture has improved actually from the Hill newspaper from when I worked there. I actually had a very boss who I did not treat me well. It was a male boss, and I was able to get him removed as my manager because he treated me and this other young woman differently than he treated other people in the newsrooms. And so from going back to now, and I freelance for the Hill sometimes, I actually think it's improved, and I think it's a better place for women. And I think also in general, what that is, again, going back to what I said earlier about the beauty of the internet is that women, I think, as was mentioned, I founded a digital TV network online, and we were able to get a lot more reach and traction, I think, than if I had just gone the traditional old school route with legacy media. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for women. Yeah, there's a lot of hate and blowback as well, but at the same time, I think uh, you know the great part of the internet, it is democracy in the purest sense of people being able to have their message heard. So.